And he just told me that, Johnny, like, remember, like, that's from the books, it looks like that. But really what the design process is, a lot of time it's like a box of tools. You pull it out when you need it. You need a hammer today, you pull it out and use a hammer. And then I told my mom, I'm gonna go to this boot camp. It was $9,800. I told my mom, don't worry, it started with my friend. And my mom's like, that's definitely a scam.
Welcome to Creative Juices, the podcast where we drink juice with the world's leading creatives and unpack their journeys and practical tips to craft more meaningful stories, products, and lives. All opinions shared are personal and don't represent those of our employers. I'm your host, Justin Eitoku-Wong. Today's guest is my good friend, Johnny Huang, senior product designer with an impressive resume that includes Meta, Google, and now the startup world. This conversation is packed with fascinating insights to help you on your creative journey. Some things we cover include how Johnny broke into the design industry without a design major, how we can learn to use AI as creatives, what Johnny did to grow his soft skills to lead workshops and influence teams, and how design thinking can improve how we approach problem solving in all aspects of our lives. We're sitting here drinking some cranberry juice.
I'm a designer now at startup. I grew up in Taiwan and moved to the US when I was 13. And I think because of that cultural shift, I was always been very perceptive to how people behave around me and why people do things a certain way they do. And in college, I studied international relations because I was very interested in people and interned for the government, realized it's a graveyard of efficacy. So I want to switch gears. The rest of my family, they're all engineers. So the crossroad of humanities and engineering is essentially design. And that's kind of how I got into design and I went to a boot camp and started at a consultancy in Chicago before I moved out to Bay Area for Google, and then went back in consultancy for a little bit at Frog Design. I also taught a little bit at universities, and then now switching out to do some startups.
I feel like a lot of people have mixed opinions about boot camps, but it seems like it worked out for you.
Yeah, it worked out for me. I graduated with international relations. It was kind of difficult to find a specific skill set that applied to it immediately. So there were a lot of different sales jobs or insurance or bank, and I didn't feel like there was a connection between me and the job. It's like, okay, it's just a damn job.
Yeah.
And then I ran into one of my friend who was like, dude, me too. I'm also looking for a job. I don't know what to do, but did you hear this other buddy of us? He's starting a boot camp. I was like, interesting. Well, here's all the material. Just look at it. And it was web design. At that point, I was starting to take classes from Harvard CS50 to learn how to code. And it's fun. I can code, but I didn't imagine myself doing that for my profession every day. And I was like, web design, okay, I think I have a sense for aesthetics. I may not be able to create really beautiful stuff immediately, but at least I can tell between something that looks good and something that looks bad. And so it's about the craft to get there. Then I told my mom, I'm going to go to this boot camp. And it's going to be, how much was it back then? It was $9,800 at that point when I joined. Yeah. I told my mom, don't worry, it started with my friend. And my mom's like, that's definitely a scam. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. And the boot camp actually turned out to be very different from what I thought. In fact, it definitely changed my career trajectory. The boot camp, that was 6 days a week. It was in Chicago, 6 days a week from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And it was for 4.5 months, 5 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's intense.
So it's quite intense. Imagine it's like a whole school year, but just, squeezed into 4 months. The instructor, he was very good with his craft, but he was very, very strict. He really knocked it in us very fast. And he was, I would say he was very effective. He's this Korean man who just had, large personality, and just, he day one, he told us, I'm going to be your drill instructor. This is going to be rough. Yeah. And he was, people cried during that. He would say things like lacerate you, all these kind of things, but I didn't mind it because I'm there to learn. Right. I'm just, okay, yeah, I don't care about what you say. I just want to, soak it in. So that was really effective. And then towards the end of the boot camp, they pair you up with a local startup and you work with them. And so you have two different clients. So you do have real world projects that you do end up working with them. And I think that was really important to help get me foot in the door into that first real job, because you can go in there and say, yeah, I have worked on real projects with real experiences. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, the bootcamp experience, to me, it was And also, given that I didn't come from a design background, I came from an international relations background. So yeah, that was definitely a lot of like, there's some people that came from art school that definitely felt like, man, the stuff they put together, they just look good. So that, I want to say that visual part is still a thing where I felt like it was a big gap for me going in.
Yeah, visual. I feel like that's very common in other people going from boot camps or non-traditional art backgrounds.
Yeah. I think he was very harsh because he treated us like professionals on the very first day, which was tough, right? I'm like, I'm going to boot camp because I know nothing about design. And then someone treats you like, okay, assuming that you're a designer on the first day. So it was tough, but also quite effective because it got us used to, some of us never went to art school. So we probably had to go through that. We go through that every day now, like in design reviews, it's like you put something together and it just gets shredded to pieces.
Yeah, it's really effective for critique, getting that preparation right there.
So I think it was very effective in that sense, prepping us for what it's like in the real world. And frankly, the first job I went to was a consultancy where they sign off designers and developers, engineers, scrum masters into companies that need these. And the reason why I wanted to get into consultancy was because you kind of in a short amount of time, you experience a lot of different fields without having to switch jobs. So I worked on a project where it's a pilot thing where you turn the whole Discover app. What if we can make this a conversation interface? Can we embed this in Messenger or iMessage or something like that? But that was a lot of fun. You worked on projects with embedding Alexa into a car or real estate search, B2B, food. You get to try a lot of different things in a very short amount of time. And to me, that was very important because I knew that the goal when I got out of bootcamp, I applied to like all the big companies like Google, Uber, all these things, and I did not get into any of them. So you might as well spread your experience, especially early career, breadth over depth. And then so when you do, try to go into one of these, at least there's some things in your, that you can pull experience as relevant you can pull out from. Like, you're doing search. I did something that's like real estate smart search. That's maybe something that can be similar, right?
Yeah, it's a really good way to stand out, to be like, hey, I actually did something very similar. I feel like it's pretty crucial that you've worked on real life projects in it. So I feel like a lot of the criticism in boot camps is like, you just learn a bunch of theory and then you have no idea how it actually translates to stuff. And in the real world, it's so different.
One of the most important things I remember from my instructor was went through this, and every designer knows the Stanford D school thing, right?
The like hexagons.
Yeah, the hexagons. And then as we were running through some projects, me and, you have some partner and we're working through on the startup. I'm like, I was telling my instructor, I was like, dude, man, like, I don't know how to do this. Like we don't have any research, there's like barely any time to prototype. I don't know how the hell do we, how do I execute on this? And he just told me that, Johnny, like, remember, like, that's from the books. It looks like that. But really what the design process is, a lot of times it's like a box of tools. You pull it out when you need it. You need a hammer today, you pull it out and use a hammer. But it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Like, every designer always has a portfolio perfectly laid out, all these things. But in reality, it happens a lot messier. Because you kind of have to adapt to change all the time. And you're always working in imperfect conditions. You may not always have the perfect research. You may not always have the time to prototype fully and get that result back before you move on. Sometimes I do think there is especially over time, you do develop this designer instinct. Like, I don't think that's going to work. And I think sometimes that's a value of senior designer as opposed to junior designer, is that you do develop some sort of instinct that this should work the first time, or it's not going to work this time, and you save some of that.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually one of the biggest gaps for people in school versus in the working environment. When you're in school, you learn like almost like to-do list of the design process.
Yeah.
You like start with personas. Yeah. I've had younger designers be like, oh, I can't figure out how to make a journey map for my project. And I'm like, do you need a journey map?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I don't know. It just like, are you supposed to do a journey map?
Right.
Like, aren't I supposed to use a bunch of sticky notes for stuff?
Yeah. Like, where are the sticky notes? Yeah. I'm not a real designer if I can't find the sticky notes.
Exactly. I feel like it's not only like learning tools to use, but when you don't need to use them, and like what are the trade-offs between different tools, I feel like is important to learn.
It is a lot of soft skills, and I think these things are quite difficult to teach in school, and for sure it's not something you can teach in a boot camp.
What experiences do you think have helped you gain those soft skills?
I did some theater, we did some improv, kind of stuff. Frankly, I found that stage presence helped a lot, as in just being comfortable in front of people, like, all right, everybody, let's let's run through this workshop. First thing we're going to do is this. Second thing, sometimes it does feel like you have to turn on like a different persona. Like I remember seeing the stats somewhere that most designers are introverts.
Mm.
And I also feel like there are times where I'm quite introverted. But for sure, sometimes when you're trying to host a workshop, trying to get everybody together, you need to turn on a certain other persona, and just, okay, now you're kind of pulling the group together, make everybody feel excited. It shouldn't be a dread. Fun ideas come out when people are having fun.
Yeah.
Some of these things that I've done in improv was also quite fun as practices to just get people loosen up, some icebreakers, all these things. So that's definitely one thing that I found was helpful, was being comfortable doing, sometimes, especially if you're in a big organization, leading and running these workshops. You never thought I would have to do this. It's like you become a designer because at first you're like, oh, I love making beautiful things. I love thinking about people. I love, once I know what's going on, and you just spend your time tweaking around the pixels and color. But in the end of the day, in fact, that's like just the final 10%. The 90% of the time is, everybody, the PM, the engineer, business designer, we might all agree on paper what the solution or the concept is. But as soon as you put it into something tangible, right? Because our job is to translate something from concept into something tangible. We're that first phase. And as soon as people see something that's tangible, everybody's got an opinion. They're like, wait a minute, this is not how I imagined. Wait a minute. And then you're like, oh, hold on. Yeah, right. Somebody can have no context, walk in and just like, I don't like that color. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. But that's a reality of it. And so I think going into design, a lot of us never thought about how much managing the expectation of different people's opinion and different people's perspective, and also the vested interest in these really mattered, with the final product.
Yeah. And I feel like everything you mentioned before also really resonated with me, of the improv stuff. And I feel like I'm also a similar background. I didn't do much theater stuff when I was younger, but I also did leadership communication related stuff. And I feel like a lot of it did translate. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, to your point, most of the designers I've met, I feel like are introverted, but they've found ways to take up influence in the room and have more of a stage presence, or we're
thrusted into that role, whether it's something that's by nature or not. Right?
Have you heard of the matchbox study? Basically, they gave people a matchbox and a bunch of matches, and then they gave them a candle, and they're like, light the candle on the wall without getting it to drip on the floor.
Okay.
And so a bunch of people were like, okay, we'll try to pin the candle to the wall. It's on the wall, but it's dripping everywhere.
Right.
And then a few people realized, oh, I can use the matchbox, not just the matches.
Right.
And pin the matchbox to the wall, put the candle on there. And they actually realized that people who were made happier were basically able to come with a solution easier, because they're in that mindset of play.
So that reminded me of, this is my favorite icebreaker.
Yeah.
And I saw this at, I think it was Config. So they did this exercise where, imagine there's a brick here, right? Okay. So I'll give you 3 minutes, the whole room. Write down as many things as you can use this brick for. Actually, write down 20 things you can use this brick for in 3 minutes. Okay. So everybody's writing them down, right? First thing, people's like, okay, you can build things, build a wall. You can use it as a paperweight, and then maybe you can lift it as weights. And then as you keep pushing further, it gets harder and harder, right? The first 5 are probably easy, and then the next 5 is probably harder. And if you can get to 15, that's crazy. And then you start seeing crazy things that comes out, like, oh, you can use it as a weapon. Throw it at people, crazy things like that. But what's interesting is study result shows that probably the first 7 across just everybody is roughly the same things. Mm-hmm. So it is that squeezing that idea out when you can, innovation or, thinking differently comes out after you squeeze out those very obvious points. And sometimes you do need a little bit of time and space to play to get to that part, or just experiences outside of your usual routine, right?
Yeah.
If I've only ever walked to work and come home and I don't do anything else, I'm so busy at work that I don't have room for anything else. You don't really have inspiration and input from, that you can make these strange connections of, but what if instead of, changing this. I remember seeing something like that. That was totally good. Then
I was actually there at the config talk. I remember doing the exercise, and at first, because we were in a room with designers, I was like, oh shoot, we're probably gonna have to tell other people what we wrote down. So I was like a little bit had that pressure of, okay, I got to do creative or interesting ones. But then I was struggling because I was like, oh, what other people think about what I wrote? And who are the people sitting next to me? And then after a while, I was like, oh shoot, the timer's going to run out. And then that's when I doubled the noun of
you just start. But isn't that something that's similar in a way? Like some of that improv practice too is get other people out of your head.
Yeah.
In a way, there's a filter that we have naturally, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. This is how a brick is supposed to use all of these things. And suddenly now it's toss that out. Yeah. Toss that out the window, take that filter away. And then you can, okay, well, what is a brick really? It's just like a heavy, block, a heavy rectangle. Well, what is a heavy rectangle that I can, as opposed to a brick, what are the things that you can use it for? Speaking of improv.
Yeah.
There's this other thing in improv that really help at meetings, stakeholder alignments and all this thing is the yes and.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes and.
Yeah. You never tell people, well, no, not really. It's that's a good point. And,
That's a good point. Also, speaking about the idea generation, ping-ponging ideas, I feel like a lot of my best ideas have just been on walks and I'm about to go to sleep and also shower when it's individual ideas and it's not collaborative.
Right. There's this book called the book is called Imagine. It talks about where these things come from, and people often think about designers, oh, you're just creatives, you just come up with the wildest stuff, right? But frankly, I'm not sure if we really are creative in that sense. It is our job to figure out how to solve some of these problems from the human perspective, and we got to have some sort of sense with aesthetics. But this person talks about the creative part about solving a problem. Often it's not always just in design. It's not design jobs. Sometimes it's a tech breakthrough, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's from the PM, sometimes it's from the designer. And this book, Imagine, they talk about creativity is often not coming up with something net new.
Yeah.
Right. If you think about all the creative stuff we've seen around, it's finding something that's existing and something that's existing, but you made this connection between the two that nobody's ever made these two connections before.
Yeah.
And that comes from just different kind of experiences outside of just, in front of a computer doing the same thing. You kind of have to step out of, have other things that's going on in life that can give you some of that. I think it was, same thing at that same Figma talk. I think the person who made WORDL talked about how he works on Reddit, but he's also a board game enthusiast. So what he did was he just made this thing for him and his wife. He was making this crossword thing, but he really liked board games. So he incorporated a lot of the board game feel and element and, almost like the tactileness and the color and all these things.
That's Steal Like an Artist. Have you read that book?
No.
Basically, the idea is artists just steal from each other.
Right.
And you just, but there's a good and bad way to steal.
Right.
A bad way to steal is you just take the exact same idea and you just copy it, basically. And that's copyright infringement. The good way is to take the idea, remix it a little bit with your own style or something else, and then it's something net new.
Right.
When I was younger, there was the defining moment where I was just putting stamps everywhere of pre-existing designs. Then I printed my design out and I was so excited. And my teacher was like, hey, you just copying other people's designs. That's stealing.
Right.
And so then I was like, oh my gosh, I can never use anyone's design or thinking ever again. And so after that, I was like, all right, I didn't even want to use filters on social media and stuff because I was like, oh well, someone else made the filters,
right? And
so now I have to manually change my RGB colors. And then after a while, I was like, oh, how are people so genius at coming up with ideas? And I'm like, and then I would ask people, and they'd be like, oh, I just took inspiration from this YouTube video that I saw,
right?
Or Behance or Dribble or something. And then you kind of realize oh, people are just stealing from each other.
You look at a lot of the DJs.
Yeah,
today, right? You remix old songs with some modern elements, and I'm not an expert in AI. I wouldn't say, and this is just my personal take on it. I think AI is kind of like a calculator. It's like a tool that can enhance and speed up things, but it doesn't take over how you think about to solve the math equation. Right?
Yeah.
At least that's where I think, AI is right now. But that said, and I don't know, it's an interesting thing because for humans as well, like do you think it is possible for somebody to create something that new? Like a completely different way of doing art, right? Like for example, like Monet, when he started doing Impressionism, or with dots kind of thing. I'm not an art history person.
Yeah.
But, perhaps that is something that new that nobody's ever thought about. You know what? I'm just going to, right? As opposed to brush strokes and all these things. So I don't know. I don't know if AI would do that, right? Like, hey, create a, artwork in a completely net new style, like that we've never ever seen before. I've heard of this really cool thing. Like, think of some really cool logos you've seen, really clever logos, right? And I'm not specializing in logo or something, but they generally say like a good logo is exactly what it's supposed to be, but just with one twist.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes it's like a negative space of something, that one twist, but too many twists, then it loses its meaning. It has to be very evident about what it is. Or just one twist on top of it.
Speaking of logos, this is my family's old logo. So it's like supposed to be 9 bamboo.
Oh, that's really cool.
And then there's a circle around it. It's called kamon. And it's like originally it was used for battle purposes. So like when the samurai would go into war, they'd have these like flags basically.
Right.
And they identify which clan you're in.
Right.
And so you'd be like, all right, that guy's part of my team.
Yeah. I guess follow that flag. It's like the bannerman. Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes I wonder if they'd be like, oh shoot, I forget which
oh, it's like, man, that designer definitely copied from our our flag. And I can't tell which one's which.
Exactly.
So it is kind of like on a mass communication thing. How can I tell like who's a friend, who's not? And meanwhile, at the same time, like sometimes you don't really hate each other too. It's not that obvious. They might be my next door neighbor, or something. So it is like a mass communication. How do we, I guess maybe sometimes it's like in a visual way, communicate like who's friend, who's foe. Logos definitely, in my opinion, it's top there because it's using a very graphical way to capture an entire identity.
Exactly.
So if you want a good logo, it triggers you have to first understand what is, my identity. What is that core thing I want to communicate?
Yeah.
Maybe logo designer, brand designers are even more undervalued than us as product designers, perhaps, right? Because at least at the end of the day, we come up with like a series of screens or a prototype. I do know sometimes like brand designers or logo designers, people are like, dude, at the end of the day, it's just like this. It's just like a logo. Like why do I need to pay you that much? But a good logo really does take a lot of thinking and ask you a lot more introspective questions. And you have to define all of these things to be able to imagine. It's like either it's a whole company or an entire person, just that whole idea of that encapsulated in one little visual.
Yeah. So speaking of your portfolio, when was the last time you updated your portfolio?
Yeah, in December I started. I don't know about you. I coded up my own portfolio.
Oh, yeah.
I think the code started back in like 2016. And I've like evolved it various different iterations of it, but the foundation of it's still the same code structure. And I did it just raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I used like no libraries or anything. Has that been helpful in your career as a product designer, knowing how to code?
I didn't study CS in college, but I did take like CS classes because I was just interested. I feel like a little bit helpful in knowing how to communicate with engineers and also making fun side projects for myself. But like day to day, I don't really use code that much. I think it does help me like think more about how engineers are working, and that helps with communication and like relationship building. Like I've done like Python. I learned like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, SQL. Like, I don't know, a bunch of stuff. But what about you?
Yeah, likewise. I think a lot of times it helps. Well, it's in both ways, right? Sometimes it's like, when you just want to change one small part of the screen, they're like, or, can we just have this like slide up on top of it or something? And they're like, yeah, no, we can't. It's going to be a lot of effort. And you're like, once they explain a little bit why, it's not a trivial thing. You're like, okay, I get it. It's, actually it seems like a little change, but the entire framework's not set up that way. You can't do it.
Yeah.
So to your point, that helps. Or sometimes the other way around when they're like, no, this is going to take 3 weeks. They're like, I don't think this is going to take 3 weeks. I think we can do this a lot faster. Not that you're smarter than them or you know it better than them, but you can kind of understand, at least relate to the work that's, a little bit more. I do think that coding will be more and more important for designers. And you start seeing these job titles starting to pop up around as like experience engineers,
Yeah.
user interface engineers.
Yeah.
I think that gap from design to code, they're just more and more tools that's trying to get, like Framer is one of them, right? Like the gaps from design into code. I know Figma's been working on gapping this a lot more. We've had instances where, we've had no front-end engineer.
Yeah.
And I designed everything in Figma, and they just literally screenshot it, drop it in Chatgpt, pumps out the code. It's not perfect, right? There's still, this color is off, the spacing is off, but it works.
Yeah.
So I do think that that the gap between these two will get closer and closer.
Do you use Chatgpt much?
I'm searching between Claude and Chatgpt.
Oh, yeah?
Playing around with.
When do you decide to use either?
They give you very interesting different responses. Actually, yeah. I find Claude, the response they give me feels like it's got a little bit human in them. That said, sometimes it's not very fun. Like the other day I asked Claude to, okay, I'm going to toss some darts and then you tell me if I hit the bullseye or not. And Claude was just like, well, I can't interact with real world physical objects, so I can't do this for you. And then meanwhile, ChatGPT was like, okay, ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Oh yeah, it's a bullseye.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah. So it depends. But maybe like certain phrases, certain things. Hey, help me rewrite these things. It depends. I'm still playing around with the two of them, seeing,
Yeah. I used it to generate a workout routine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm trying it with my lifting equipment upstairs. I'm like,
Nice.
okay, give me, with this equipment, like try this out. There's the idea that the first brushstroke in the painting is the hardest.
Right. It's a white piece of paper.
Yeah, white piece
and
of
where do
paper.
you start?
Yeah.
And once you draw a box in there, then suddenly, okay, everything else
Yeah, it's
comes
easier.
along. Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like I think AI really helps with that. Like, I don't trust it to give the final draft, but I can trust it enough to give me a starting point that I can workshop and iterate. And I wonder if that's also where like the design industry might go more with AI taking a first pass and then designers iterating on it.
But again, like kind of what we talked about, like by the time we're in Figma, there's like a lot of steps of insights that you've already distilled to reach the point of this. Yeah.
The Figma part is like the easy part. I made like for an article that I did, I made a little pie chart, how I end up spending my time. And black was how much of Figma time I was using. And then the rest is communicating my design decisions and the strategy and the thinking. And it was like Pac-Man, basically. A small black part and the rest is just yellow.
It's Pac-Man before he opens a mouse.
Exactly.
This is one of the best quotes I've, also from the bootcamp that was like the difference between art and design. Design. We're not artists, we're designers. And because art is meant to be interpreted, but design is meant to be understood.
Yeah.
Right. So it's something that you knock out, assuming that most users or most people who see this will understand it the same way what you're trying to communicate to them.
Yeah.
But frankly, like even with language we're speaking, we can speak the same language. We might not even be understanding the same thing. And just imagine this design. It's not words, it's an interface. So people can interpret them radically different, or just think about how to approach this very differently. So maybe it is part of the inherent job of designers is to constantly try to communicate to other people so this is how I'm thinking of it, follow my train of thought. This is how I reach this conclusion. But sometimes to even get there, you have to, I reached this conclusion because there were these information. Do you all agree on these informations correct? Right. Sometimes that itself, that's what we find often, right? Like, the research, we don't agree with the research. We see it differently. So it's like aligning all these steps to get people to arrive at that same conclusion.
It also kind of reminded me of in college, I was taking logic classes where you have proofs.
Right.
And you have to like prove your design.
You have to know one thing that is true that everybody agrees on. I don't know, like a right angle is 90 degrees, right?
Exactly.
You start there and then you can kind of...
I think that was a helpful beginner framework. But after that, then you have to get the intuition to like kind of just like do heuristics of like, I've seen this enough times. I can pattern recognize this is like what's happening. And here's like here's a solution that I know will work. I don't have to explain it, but if you did ask me, then I
can explain it. Yeah.
So I think that gave me confidence, creatively.
It's fascinating you say that because I've seen a lot of designers struggle with this. And in fact, sometimes I also struggle with it when I don't don't pay attention to it too, is explaining that design rationale and not assuming too much like that.
Yeah.
It's weird. Sometimes you want to explain things from the very beginning till the end, but sometimes there's not enough time. There's 15 minutes, you need to get to the point. But if you get to the point without letting them know where it comes from, they're not buying it, right? They're like, but I don't like it, right? Sometimes you might not like it, but there's a reason why it looks like this.
Yeah.
So it's being one is understanding the person who I'm talking to, how much context do they have?
Yeah.
And frankly, distilling that insight story down to just enough context that gets them to arrive at that conclusion.
Yeah.
Like walk them there. And the challenge sometimes, if you have 5 days to get there, sure, you can, right? But if you have 1 hour, that's very different from 30 minutes or 15 minutes. You see them, hey, by the way, I want to show you this really quick.
Yeah.
And at least with a lot of designers, I've seen some, one of the challenge is actually voicing that out loud of what you're thinking and talking out loud. It is hard. It is hard to, sometimes when you're thinking of something, you're trying to solve a problem, you're thinking out loud. But meanwhile, though, it's not just like stream of consciousness, like I'm doing this. Oh, I probably shouldn't have done that. It's you gotta be telling the story as you go, almost structuring a story in your head as you're solving this and walk them through. So it's not a prepared script because it is improvisation. It is something that's something on the spot, but in a way that's understandable for somebody else to follow. It is quite a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of like presentations, when I first did my presentation as an intern or something, I had learned the process of like lettering every decision up. So then I was like, okay, so my deck needs to show everying. Like I need to explain all the rationale, because what if, this high up person is like, oh, well, why did you do blah, blah? Then I can point to the deck. And then at the time my mentor was like, he looked at my presentation. He was like, this is like 100 pages.
Right. Like, we've all been there before, right? Every designer's been there before. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he's like, okay, archive like 3/4 of them.
And you're like crying inside.
Yeah.
When you're like,
but
there's a reason why. Yeah.
That's also something that I realized in general, being concise is really important. In school, they taught us to write an essay and how to use like therefore and semicolon and all this stuff. But then in the industry world,
just enough context.
Time is money. Like, be efficient.
If you think about it, the product that comes out, right? The design, like it's not just a visual part, it's a whole product. The product really is the outcome of the organization. You know what's interesting? So did I ever tell you my undergrad I did, right? My undergrad was in international relations.
Yeah, you mentioned.
So we did some model UN and all of that stuff. One of the practice we did was, let's say one person assumes a president, one person is a secretary of state.
Yeah.
So that person's, primary focus is foreign policy, right? And then there's another person, is a campaign re-election manager. Their job is to get the president reelected.
Yeah.
When you have these kind of, and then maybe you have, a few different roles, and you have the president himself too. That's, right there. And frankly, a lot of times you toss one problem in, everybody would have their own separate interests. Sometimes the international, policy may not align with, the best outcome of that may not align with getting the president reelected.
Yeah.
Sometimes getting the president reelected may be terrible for the military. All these kind of things. And there was one practice where it's like, so what is national interest? Is there national interest?
Yeah.
Or is it personal interest, depending on who it is, right? And I remember that exercise. It was very fun. And I think sometimes it applies to design too. It's like, is there a objective that high, or who are the stakeholders you need to make sure that's happy in the room, right? Yeah. And actually, this is one practice I found that was quite, that I've taken with me, is the RACI model. That's always been, before I knew about this model, I've always struggled with this stakeholder conversation. Having that RACI model definitely helped. Like, first thing as a design, before you go into research and all that, establish that RACI model.
So real quick, for context, the RACI model is a framework used to clarify roles and responsibilities for projects, so everyone knows who's accountable for what. It's particularly helpful in large teams when there's a ton of stakeholders involved. As an example, imagine you're designing this new feature, you're designing wireframes, but approvals are taking forever because PMs, designers, engineers, everyone's weighing in and conflicting feedback stalls the progress. So the solution here is you could define a RACI model. So you have R for responsible, the person doing the work, like the designer executing the UI. You can have A, so that's accountable, the decision maker who owns the outcome, like the design lead or strategist person. You have C, which is consulted, so people who provide input before decisions are made, like the product or project manager. You have informed, so that's people who need updates but don't contribute directly, so like the front end or back end engineer. And by setting this up earlier, you can streamline decision-making and avoid these endless feedback loops.
Sometimes you can use the same design thinking framework, even designing a meetup for like-minded people to hang out with.
Yeah.
Maybe you're creating a movie or a film that's of a certain message. That's a lot of design thinking behind it too, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that actually I still love about product design. And it's like, I find it to be applicable to not just digital interfaces.
Yeah.
It really does apply to a lot of things that you see across, life, and a lot of things, how you approach problems, how you approach, like a lot of it is design thinking.
Yeah.
And I like that a lot.
I mean, it's basically just creative problem solving.
Yeah. I think it is almost, at least in the context we're speaking, right? There's probably different things that's, maybe there are different kinds of design that I'm not aware of. Like, let's say like architecture, like systems architect design, that might be something completely different, right?
Yeah.
But at least the kind of design that in general, I don't think you can separate the design and the human. So to me, design has always been kind of like solving problems through a human perspective. Like you cannot detach the humanity away from the problem. And okay, I'm a humanities background person, and that's always been really important to me, because I think at the root of everything, at the end of the day, it's still human.
A lot of the insights Johnny gave in this episode are ones that I give mentees myself, particularly the one about learning to treat the design process like a box of tools. You can find Johnny on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/JohnnyCL.Huang, and you can find me on Instagram at Justin Wong, or the show at creativejuices.pod. Links are in the description. Let me know in the comments, what is a misconception about design or creativity you've learned? I'll reply to as many as I can. And if you have guest suggestions or feedback, send them my way. I want this to be as useful as possible for your creative journey. Keep creating, and I'll see you in the next one.